I think the data center market itself is quite a vast, fragmented market, certainly in the UK, and I think there's varying degrees of data centers and providers. At one hand you've got the large-scale kind of wholesale providers, and you've got the hyperscalers that are typically using those providers to provide their data center space in the UK. We're probably seeing a lot of that capacity being used and a shortage in that capacity. Certainly, recently there's been a lot of that with the likes of AWS and Azure moving into the UK. So I think that's an interesting space because I think there's capacity issues and there's some growth challenges there for the general providers that are working in that space. At the other end, you've then got obviously some of the smaller providers that have decided to build small regional data centers. Some of those providers are probably quite niche, probably built those data centers with smaller budgets, potentially got challenges around how they've invested in infrastructure. So maybe targeting SMEs as the customer base might have some challenges with how that infrastructure meets the kind of requirements that some of those organisations have, certainly around the green credentials and the efficiencies of those data centres. And I think what you're also seeing is in that space, the end users are typically now on this move to cloud. So maybe those data centres are built for a segment of the market that actually may not be there in the medium term. And then obviously you've got sort of the providers that sit in the middle that are maybe more invested, larger data centers, probably targeting that sort of mid-size enterprise. So interesting times, lots of challenges, lots of interesting opportunities, but certainly still very fragmented. I think ultimately, yes, that's what's going to happen. I think, the standard is that not one box fits all people, and I think, people are on a journey, and, people are taking certain applications as a SaaS application. Actually thinking about Node 4 and what we do as an organisation, we use Office 365, we use People HR, which is a completely SaaS-driven application. But then internally we have our own infrastructure, some of it legacy, some of it new, and it's sat on a varying degree of different technologies because they're the right technologies for those applications to sit on because of where we are in our development and our journey as an organisation. So I think any organisation, mid-sized organisation, is having those same challenges and they're going through a transformation. So ultimately I think that is the way that people are going to continue to procure going forward, yes. Big data can mean lots of things to different people, and to some people what they would classify as big data really isn't big data. So I think if we really are talking about large-scale data, hundreds of terabytes, petabytes of data, I think obviously huge requirement on resource, in the data center to provide that, both the compute resource and the storage resource, because typically that big data is being used for something, so analytics, whatever it means. So there is a huge requirement on resource, and typically that resource is quite peaky and trophy. So, an organisation might want to analyse that data, but only for small periods of time to get the answers that they need from that data, provide them with whatever it is their objective is, and then to adjust or deal with accordingly, whether it's a retail chain or whatever it might be. So, I think in the true big data sense, ultimately I think the only winners in that world will be the hyperscalers, right? So you've got the likes of Google with Bigtable and AWS, etc. And I think, if we really truly are talking about big data, that's where that's going to end up. They've got the scale, they've got the infrastructure, they can do it at a competitive rate because of that scale and that infrastructure that they've got. So I think ultimately that's where those applications will reside. But internal to other organisations, they have sensitive data, they have structured data that they may want to retain themselves. To them it's big data. It still is large amounts of data, terabytes of data, whatever it may be. But for them, the way in which they're analysing it, the way in which they're using that data may mean that they want to put that data inside their own private controlled infrastructure inside a data center. But that's just then becomes a typical workload that you would see in a traditional sense. So yeah, I mean, I think this comes into two parts. So I think you've kind of got what's happening inside the data center and what's happening with the technology inside the data center, and ultimately, you know, technology in the data center is driving efficiency in lots of ways. You know, cooling, energy management, energy efficiency, all of those are a big part of the data center, and how you manage the environment and the infrastructure. And then on the flip side, you've then got the technology that's driving the usage and the capacity in those data centers, and you know, that is a huge variable. And I think we talked about software-defined networks. You know, that is a potential that's going to drive efficiency in the data center, because there is, you know, in certain scenarios where you're removing the physical infrastructure, all this, you know, separate components, in the same way as virtualization took hold in the compute sort of side. You've got that same thing happening in certainly the network side, where you are virtualizing that infrastructure into single components, or you're actually removing the components completely and turning them into software components that sit in the compute layer and using the same efficiencies and scale that you got from virtualizing the traditional compute resource. So I think lots of technology advancements that are driving some of those change, and ultimately that will potentially reduce capacity. But then on the flip side, you've got people needing more and more storage, you know, huge amounts of data consumption, in a way that you are kind of seeing this plateau effect of what's happening with capacity in the data center, because one element's kind of being replaced with the other. Whereas if that didn't happen, you may have seen this mass growth of infrastructure, but actually what you're starting to see is a bit of consolidation, but that's kind of just evening out, in my opinion, the plateau in the effect of the growth in other areas of the infrastructure.